Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Well, as I keep talking about, because I'm super excited about it, my daughter and I are headed to France next week. Going to be in Paris for a few days. We're going to be in Normandy for a few days, and then we're headed to the Somme, where I'm hoping to do another 6-part video series telling more stories from the Somme. And in both Normandy and the Somme, I'm going to be with my friend Rob, who lives just outside of London. And you're actually going to see him real soon on a video on VTH Extra that I'm finally editing that shows some of the behind-the-scenes stuff from my trip to the UK back in late January, where, among other things, I went to a Fulham game with Rob against Tottenham Hotspur. He brought me along for that. He covers a lot of their games as a sports photographer. So a while back, I reacted to his video on 5 misconceptions about World War I. And since Rob and I are going to be together on one of the most important World War I battlefields next week, I thought it would be fun to go and look at his follow-up to that, the part 2 that he did. So we're going to look at 5 more misconceptions about World War I. Link is in the description to the original content. Head over to Rob's channel, give him a subscription, check out some of his videos. He does a lot of great on-site stuff, but also some stuff now from his studio. And his most recent video where he showed some of the sights in the Bois Jacques, you might even see yours truly in the background. It was a really cold morning. But let's dive into part 2. Drinking from his Fulham mug.
What's up, guys? How you doing? Welcome to another History in Your Hand and another video of us sat right here in the office. So
I still gotta say, though, Rob, wearing the New York Knicks hoodie just kind of rubs me the wrong way. The Knicks knocked my Cavaliers out of the playoffs this year, so man, I gotta get you some good Cavaliers gear.
Last week, I put out a video about the top 5 misconceptions or top 5 myths of World War I of the Great War. And it seemed to be quite well received. And in fact, my friend Chris over at Vlogging Through History very kindly did a reaction video to it. And so there's a whole load of new people here on the channel.
Awesome.
So welcome to all of you guys.
My pleasure.
I thought with the fact that that video seemed to be quite popular and the fact there is an awful lot of topics you can talk about when it comes to 5 misconceptions about the Great War, that I would make a part 2. And that's what we're doing right here. 5 myths from the First World War, part 2. So I suppose 10 myths, because we've already done 5, and today we're going to do a new 5. If you're interested in checking out part 1 of this video, I'm going to link it at the end, or you can go find it on my channel, then come back and watch part 2, whichever way you would like to do it. Before I get into it, I'm going to ask you guys to do all the usual YouTube stuff for me. Hit the like button, comment something below for me, subscribe if you haven't already, because it helps.
I don't ask people to do that nearly enough. I guess it's because that's what everybody does, you know. But yeah, if you haven't already subscribed to this channel and like the videos, it really does help a lot. The reason people ask for it is because, listen, YouTube's such a competitive market, right? And we're fighting for YouTube to recommend those channels. You ever find a channel in your recommend and you're like, holy cow, I love this channel. There's a new one I just started watching. I watch a lot of videos of guys going to like European football matches, and there's a new one where he just, like, they throw a dart at the map and then they go to a game wherever that is. They just did one in Seattle and it showed up in my recommendeds, and now I've been binge watching their channel. So when you like and you comment and you're subscribed and you watch a video all the way through, all of those things help tremendously to get YouTube to recommend your videos to new people. That's how channels grow.
Helps me out loads and loads on this channel. Right, let's get into it with myth number 1, or maybe we say myth number 6. And misconception number 1 is going to be to say that Germany started the war. It was all their fault. Now, don't get me wrong, Germany had a large part to play in the start of the Great War, but it wasn't entirely their fault. And in fact, in some cases, there was a bit of hesitation from Kaiser Wilhelm to get involved in conflict because he knew that it would bring Britain and various other countries into the war. A real flyby version of how the First World War started is Franz Ferdinand, the Archduke of Austria, was assassinated. It was traced back to an extremist group in Serbia. Austria blamed Serbia and used it almost as an excuse to invade Serbia. Austria was allied with Germany, which meant that Germany supported Austria. Serbia was allied with Russia, which meant that Russia supported Serbia. Therefore, Germany and Russia were on opposing sides, and if there was an Austrian invasion of Serbia, it meant that Russia might declare war on Germany, Germany declare war on Russia. France was allied with Russia, so Germany knew if they went to war against Russia on one side of the country, they would then have to fight against France on the other side of the country. Britain was allied with France, which meant Germany knew that Britain was probably going to come into the war. And of course, in the middle of all of that, there's Belgium. But ultimately, there was a lot of different causes for the Great War, and it wasn't entirely a case of Germany being at fault. I think
100% agree with everything he just said. There is no one country that can be blamed. I can give you reasons for blaming almost every country in this war, right? You can blame Austria-Hungary or you can blame Serbia for likely involvement in the plot to kill the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne. You can blame Austria-Hungary for the fact that they put demands they knew Serbia would never agree to as a pretext for war. And then when Serbia agreed to like 9.5 of them, even Germany said, well, this removes any reason for us to go to war. But Austria-Hungary did it anyway. You can blame Russia for not backing off of their mobilization. If they had backed down from mobilization, Germany probably backs down too, and then there's no major war. You can blame France for allying with Russia, but I think France is probably one of the ones you can't blame a whole lot for this war. You could blame Belgium for not just letting Germany pass through. I don't know how you do that, but I'm just saying you can find fault with a lot of different countries. Germany's the one that takes the blame at the end of the war, and so that's why people all remember it that way, because Germany was the big brother to Austria-Hungary, and when they gave basically Austria-Hungary carte blanche to assert its will on Serbia, there's blame to be had there. But like I said, there's blame to go around. I would blame Russia and Germany pretty equally, but Austria-Hungary most of all.
Sometimes there is a misconception that the war started with Germany just deciding, you know what, we're going to invade Belgium and France. And actually there was a lot more to it than that. Don't get me wrong though, ultimately Germany knew full well that if Austria was to invade Serbia, it would trigger the start of a European war. They supported Austria in doing that, so they do still hold account for part of the reason why the Great War started, but it wasn't a case that they were entirely to blame. Okay, moving into myth number 2, or shall we call it number 7. And that's to say that the Western Front was the main front of the fighting in World.
So it's interesting he mentions this because I saw some people being critical of the fact that his myths, the first one, were so heavily focused on the Western Front. And listen, and my response to that was the same response I'll give now. The fact that, for example, I focus so heavily on the Western Front when I'm talking about World War I is not to say that the Western Front was the most important, though I would argue it probably was. It's because I'm an American who speaks English, who's part of Western culture, and almost the entire audience who watches this channel is either from the U.S., Canada, the United Kingdom, or Germany. Those are my top 4 countries that watch this channel. So it makes sense that I'm going to focus much more heavily on the place where those 4 countries were fighting each other. It doesn't mean it's more important. It just means it's more important to the audience who watches this channel.
World War I. Now, don't get me wrong, the Western Front was pretty substantial, and of course, especially to us Britons, it's the important front, right? Because that's where all of our troops fought. Well, not entirely where all of
It's funny that while we're sitting here watching this video, I just got a text from Rob. Let's see what he's talking about right now. We're talking about he gave me his list of the videos he's planning on making. We're going to be at the Somme. He's going to do stories from Danzig Alley Cemetery. He's going to be talking about a guy named Wilfred Neville and his kicked footballs across no man's land. That was something actually a number of soldiers did on the first day of the Somme, is while they were marching across no man's land, they were kicking a football. He's going to do a story at Newfoundland Memorial Park, which if you haven't seen my video on that, it's an amazing site, incredible story. The first day at the Somme from a German perspective, which he's also going to film at Newfoundland Memorial. He's going to talk about Delville Wood and then Thiepval Wood. We're hoping to get into Thiepval Wood to see the trenches there because I'm going to be doing, in fact, I can tell you what my videos that I have planned are at the moment. I'm going to be doing one on the 16th Scottish, what is it, 16th? I think, is it the Royal Scots? Yeah. 100 and some well, there wasn't 100 and some. I think there were 75 different Scottish football teams that were represented in that battalion. A number of guys, the entire Hearts of Midlothian team signed up for the war and were a part of that battalion. It was known as McRae's Battalion. We're going to tell their story at Sausage Valley. I'm going to be doing a video on the Ulster Division. I'm going to be telling the story of Walter Lloyd, whose medals I have. I'm going to tell the story of the Welsh Division at Mehmet's Wood. We're going to go to the Thiepval Memorial and tell the story of that, and then more stories of the fallen from various cemeteries. So, anyway.
Our troops fought, but certainly the main theatre of war for the British Army. However, when you compare the Western Front with the Eastern Front, on the side where Russia is positioned, actually it is a lot bigger. And when you look on a map and you see the Eastern and Western Front compared, the Eastern Front absolutely dwarfs the Western Front.
That's true.
Sometimes
the Eastern Front was much more mobile than the Western Front. The Western Front bogged down almost immediately into trench warfare. There was trench warfare on the Eastern Front, but huge battles with huge numbers of soldiers being captured in these battles, like hundreds of thousands at a time. But yeah, the Eastern Front's huge, but by 1917, 1918, the Eastern Front kind of ceases to be the main focus of the war.
There is a misconception that the Western Front was the main piece, the biggest piece where all of the action happened, when actually that Eastern Front had a huge amount of fighting and is a lot bigger and a lot longer than the Western Front.
Yep.
Okay, moving into myth number 3, and that is to say that France rolled over and Britain had to go in and rescue them. I think sometimes there is a perception of this, probably with both of the world wars, that France just rolled over and Britain had to pile in and save them. Well, actually in the Great War, that is far from the truth. Yeah. When Britain entered the Great War, they only held a small section of the front line. In 1914, it was about 21 miles long. Through the course of the war, that grew, and by 1918, the British Army held a section of the front that was 87 miles long.
I actually was just researching this morning because somebody left a comment in one of my videos basically saying that Britain had a huge army at the beginning of the war, and that I was lying to people to say that they didn't. Not at all the case. The British Army in 1914, when the war breaks out, is about a fourth the size of France. It's about a fourth the size of Germany. It's about a fifth the size of the Russian army. It's about a third the size of the Austro-Hungarian army. And that includes all of their territorial forces, all of their forces that are in colonies all over the world. They really didn't have, they had maybe a couple 100,000 men on the Western Front in 1914. And compare that to the millions that the French and the Germans and the Russians and the Austro-Hungarians had at the start of the war. There's really no comparison. The French held almost the entire Western Front in 1914 and had the deadliest day for any army in the war. Lost something like 24,000 killed in one day during the Battle of the Frontiers at the start of the war. And they pretty much single-handedly stopped the British Army at the first Battle of the Marne.
However, even then, at the point at which the British front line was at its largest, that still only represented less than 24% of the front line that France still held. When you look at a map of the Western Front, Britain held the kind of northwest section, not quite up to the top because Belgium had a bit up the top there as well.
Yeah, basically what you have is you have Belgium with a little sliver here at the very top. And you're going to be seeing a video eventually from me about a place called the Trench of Death, which was one of the places where Belgium held. Then you have the British from Ypres all the way down. And then you've got the Somme, and then you've got the French pretty much everywhere else. And then when the Americans come in, they kind of pour into the middle of the French area down here, but then they also have a few guys up here.
But then there is a huge amount of the front line moving down southeast past places like Verdun that the French held for the duration of the war. There was an awful lot of hard and tough fighting, and Verdun, a place where I hope to have future videos on the channel soon, it is a...
Yeah, a bunch of us might be going there together later on this year. Maybe. We'll see. And the reason that the fighting happens at the Somme in July of 1916 is because that's the place where the British and French sectors come together. There's actually an exact site on the Somme battlefield where they've got a British and a French flag, and it's like the place where the lines came together.
Place where France had to go to war for the entire 4 years, and they did an awful lot of fighting. It was not a case of Britain being the main dominating force along that Western front line. Okay, moving into myth number 4, and that is to say that most of the soldiers who fought in the First World War were killed in action. Now, sometimes that is a big misconception. There were a huge amount of casualties in the Great War, and there are certain communities, especially here in the UK, that were absolutely decimated by the Great War. We've talked previously on the channel about the PALS battalions, where men from a certain town or village would all go and fight together. And if that unit or that regiment went into some particularly heavy fighting right on the front line, sometimes you did have towns or villages where loads and loads of the soldiers who went from that area were killed. However,
and that happens a little bit in World War II as well. I'm going to be telling the story from Normandy about the guys known as the Bedford Boys. There was a National Guard company that was from Bedford, Virginia, and they had like 35 guys in one company who were in the first wave at Omaha, an Able Company, 116th Infantry, and they were just pretty much wiped out in the first 20 minutes. I think 19 guys from that one small town of like 3,000 people in Bedford, Virginia, were killed in the first wave at Omaha Beach. And that's why the National D-Day Memorial is in Bedford, Virginia, for that very reason. They lost more men on D-Day as a town than any other place on the planet. And yeah, the PALS battalions, we've talked about them before. There were towns, especially in the north of England, in Lancashire and Yorkshire, places like that, that were just devastated at places like the Somme and Passchendaele. Canada had huge casualties for particular units at Passchendaele.
However, in the bigger picture of the Great War, the British Army, for example, had about 700,000 men killed in action. Now, that's still a huge, huge number, but ultimately it represents less than 12% of the total British soldiers who went and fought in the Great War. So whilst there was certainly a huge, in fact, an unthinkable amount of people who were killed, and then of course more who were wounded on top of that, but the reality of it is that most of the men who went and fought in the Great War were not killed. Less than 12% actually lost their lives.
But then you have to figure the wounded, many of whom were maimed for life, and then of course there's probably never been a war that has had a psychological impact on soldiers like World War I did, just because of the nature of the fighting, with the trench warfare, with the attacks through no man's land, with the incessant and horrible drum fire artillery. Just the scars go so far beyond just the men who were killed or died of disease.
And moving into myth number 5, or we can call it myth number 10. And that's to say that the Great War was very much a European war. Well, that's not the case at all. During the 4 years, 1914 to 1918, more than 30 different countries declared war. By 1918, we had countries from all around the world. The European countries, but of course countries like the United States were in the war by that stage. Italy and a lot of other countries that you sometimes don't immediately think of when it comes to the Great War were all involved. The fighting, of course, was very heavy in Europe on the Western Front and the Eastern Front, but outside of that, there was fighting in Africa, in the Middle East, all around the world. It really was a global war and was not just restricted to Europe, which is often the misconception, I think, largely by a lot of British people, and certainly me before I started to really study the Great War, because naturally we start to learn about the Western Front in Europe, where most of the British troops fought.
Yeah, and it's interesting, of course, that in World War I, Japan and Italy, who are both belligerents in the war, Italy very heavily involved, Japan not as much, but Japan and Italy both fight on the sides of the Allies. They fight against the Germans in that war, but then they'll be on the same side in the Second World War.
So there we go. That just about rounds off part 2 of our 5 myths from the Great War, giving us 10 misconceptions in total. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, do me a favor, hit that like button. Make sure you stick around and watch some of our future videos. Guys, thanks for watching.
So yeah, definitely check out Rob's channel. In fact, let me show you some of the videos that he's done lately. And right now, 6,230 subscribers. Love to see that number get up over 6,500 by the time you guys are done watching this. He's got a lot of shorts from some of those places. There's the Bois Jacques video that you'll see me kind of walk by a couple times. In fact, I'll just show you part of this here. This was so much fun. We went out our tour group did, and it was still dark, and we were at the Bois Jacques as the sun came up, sitting in the Easy Company foxholes and the foxholes of the other units. But you'll see, I think you see me walk past
in the
here.
snow and the winter.
In just a second, you'll see me go past behind him.
Experience.
It was cold. That's why we're dressed so warm, and you won't even really see much of my face. There I go. That was me. And then you'll see me again, I think a few minutes later in the video, pointing out we're trying to find the spot where Joe Toy and Bill Garnier lost their legs, and I was kind of pointing it out to him there.
This kind of spot.
Yeah, that was a lot of fun. We had an awesome time on that trip. But he's got a lot of Band of Brothers stuff. He's got a lot of World War I stuff, stuff about the Battle of the Bulge from our trip that we took there, stuff on Shifty Powers you see there. Here's Thiepval. There's the site of the Christmas Truce. The Battle of the Somme at Mametz. That's going to be a story I'm going to be covering. Horace Isles, you may have seen me talk about him when I visited his grave. He was killed on the first day of the Somme, 16 years old. Good stuff. And he even did a reaction to one of my videos. So check it all out. Links in the description. Thanks, guys. We'll see you again soon.